Support comes from Mosby Building Arts, with laundry room designs meant to bring calm to everyday routines. More at callmosby.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. In 1991, Toni Popham was a 13-year-old in St. Louis facing a move out of state. It wasn't going to be permanent, but it left deeply painful, lasting impressions because where Popham was headed had a very particular way of dealing with pregnant girls. Popham's family sent her to Lynchburg, Virginia, to a place called the Godparent Home on the campus of Liberty University. The story of what happened to Popham is among several featured in a new podcast, Liberty Lost. Focused on the Liberty Godparent Home, the series delves into the experiences of women who were sent there as pregnant teens in the 90s and 2000s and faced heavy pressure, even coercion, to give up their babies for adoption. Joining me to talk about the podcast is its creator, journalist TJ Raphael. TJ, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And also with me is Toni Popham. Her mother sent her to the Godparent Home when she was just 13 years old in 1991. Toni, thank you for driving out to join us today.
Thank you.
So TJ, I'd like to start with you. How is it that this project began?
Yeah, so back in 2022, shortly following the reversal of Roe v. Wade, I was interested in pursuing a story related to abortion rights and the right to choose. And I think a lot of people are familiar with this idea that the pre-Roe era was one of dangerous back alley abortions. And that was definitely true, but it was also only one part of the pre-Roe era. This time period was one of forced birth, coerced adoption, and maternity homes. So I had put out a call on social media asking to speak to women who went through maternity homes. And I expected to hear from, baby boomers, women in their 60s and 70s. But at that time, I got an email from a woman named Abby Johnson. When she reached out to me in 2022, she was only 31 years old. And she told me that she had gone to the Liberty Godparent Home in Lynchburg, Virginia, started by Jerry Falwell. And kind of alarm bells started to go off for me immediately, knowing Falwell's legacy, that he was the founder of the moral majority, kind of the creator of the modern evangelical right. And so I set out on a mission to find other women who had gone through this maternity home. Abby had described to me a climate of pressure, coercion, and religious manipulation. And so I started scouring online message boards. I put up a post on Reddit, and that's when I connected with Toni. She was the second woman that I had talked to. And I realized that this was a much bigger story about these homes, and now in 2025, their resurgence in a post-Roe America.
Mm-hmm. Toni, how is it that you found the message that TJ was putting out? Was it the Reddit post?
It was the Reddit post. I had done a search for the Liberty Godparent Home and saw that they were actually recruiting women that were homeless and drug addicts. And when I had done that, I found the Reddit post for women that had been through the Godparent Home and connected with TJ that way.
Mm-hmm. Now, those two categories, homeless, drug addicts, this did not apply to you. Tell us about what was happening in your life at the time that Godparent Home entered into your experience.
When I was... So I was 13, when I was sent to the Godparent Home. And my mom was in a church that the pastor had gone to college with Jerry Falwell. And so he suggested that my mom send me to the home, the Jerry Falwell's home. And so I had been living with my dad. My stepmom had been very clear that she did not want us in the house during the day. So my brother and I pretty much ran around in the summertime. And so obviously we both found trouble. Mine. ended up with me being pregnant. And so then my dad wanted me to get an abortion, and I was very against it. So I ended up back with my mom, and my mom sent me to the Godparent Home after the preacher suggested that that's where I go.
Did you have any say in the matter?
I did not, no.
What kinds of conversations did happen?
Well, at first my mom said that I could come back and stay with her, that we would take care of this, it was going to be fine. And then she came to me and said that she had talked to the pastor, and this is what was happening, and this was going to be the way it was. And that was pretty much the end of the discussion. This is how it was going to be.
Mm-hmm. And did you have any familiarity at all with maternity homes? Like, did you know that they existed?
I did not. I did not know there was. If this was in 1991, I did not know that this was still happening. I did not know. I was from St. Louis, so this was all the way in Virginia. I did not. This was very far away. And so I was going to have to travel this very far away from family, from anyone I knew. And so I was very scared, very worried about it. I did not want to go. I was terrified.
TJ, you said that Toni was the second person you connected with, and that she's one of several sources that you got to connect with and who spoke with you about their experiences as pregnant teenagers at Godparent Home. Now, these are women and girls who were at the home at different times, in the early 90s, as with Toni, and then Abby, whom you mentioned, in the mid-2000s. Is there anything that stands out to you about the upbringings they had, in their families? I mean, were they at all similar?
Yeah, almost all of the women that I connected with who shared their experiences with me were from evangelical or Christian fundamentalist families. A lot of the women that I spoke to said that, their families felt a great deal of shame at the fact that they had gotten pregnant out of wedlock. And there was, this solution in the Liberty Godparent Home where these pregnant, teenagers and young women could hide their pregnancies. And, all the women that I spoke to, and initially their families had wanted them to place their children for adoption. I think your listeners might be familiar with hearing stories about this from the 1950s and 60s, but yeah, this was happening in the 1990s. It was happening in the early 2000s, and it is still happening today. But basically these, beliefs around purity culture and the traditional family really, I think, drove the parents of these girls to send them to these places and then push them towards adoption as well.
Toni, when you were this sort of preteen, did you have any formal education around sex? I mean, was purity culture something that was even, did it have that name? Did you have a sense of it?
It did. I actually went to a Christian school here in town. It was a small Christian school, and it was very, very strict. I was actually kicked out of it because a boy and I were holding hands, and we even had to wear the long dresses to play sports that were called culottes to cover our legs, made sure our knees were covered, to play sports. It was very much beat into our heads, the purity culture, and that you weren't supposed to have contact. We weren't supposed to be alone with each other. All of that was very much part of our education, even in the school, beyond education of, like reading, writing, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That was more, part of the education of the school.
When you got to the Godparent Home, was that also how it was there? I mean, I would imagine that there were not very many boys or men around, but was there also the same kind of strict adherence to rules?
There was. It was during the business hours. We were to be in the dresses, and we had to be in any kind of public hours. We had to be in dresses. We could not be in pants unless it was after hours. If we were in any of the front areas, we had to be in the dresses. We had to be, we could not listen to certain music. We couldn't watch certain TV shows. They had to approve of TV shows, the music. I got in trouble one time because I had a clock radio, and it was back in the 90s, you had the alarm clock radios.
Right, with the red?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it was on a radio station from here in St. Louis, but we were in Virginia. So it was my alarm clock, but they come in and they would check and see what station it was on. And so I had a reprimand because it came on a station there, and it wasn't an approved station. So I got a reprimand where I couldn't talk to people for so many hours or days because it wasn't on an approved radio station. And it was very strict in our rules there.
Mm-hmm. Now, your roommate, Toni, at the Godparent Home, named Zoe, is also part of this Liberty Lost podcast. What was it like to go through that experience with other girls?
Well, girls can be catty. So there was good things and bad things, and we weren't allowed to talk a whole lot with each other about a lot of our experiences. And if you were a girl keeping your baby, you didn't really want to talk a lot about it with a girl not keeping her baby. So you couldn't get real close with girls. You talked superficial. And like Zoe and I were probably the closest because we were roommates. But still, there were a lot of things you don't talk about because she couldn't keep her baby and I was keeping my baby. And so there was good and bad of it, but you don't form a whole lot of relationships because the girls just disappear once they have their babies. They don't get to really say goodbye. You don't get to see anything that happens afterwards.
Mm-hmm. TJ, what is it that you learned about what life is like at the Godparent Home in the totality of the conversations that you had with women who'd been there?
Yeah, I found a very strict and oppressive culture that all of the women I spoke to described from their time inside the home. Strict rules in addition to what Toni was saying about, how you dress, what kind of access to media you have. There was kind of 24/7 constant surveillance of these girls and young women. The handbook states, I was able to find official copies of the Liberty Godparent Home, handbook, rule book, whatever you want to call it. And it says, girls are not allowed to have unapproved visitors for the first month of their stay, including their own family members. I mean, Toni told me a story about when her family came to visit for Christmas and she wasn't allowed to spend the night with them. And that, kind of took my breath away. I imagine as a 13-year-old, it's Christmas time, you'd want to do that. But there was also a culture of silence, as Toni described, and fear that many of the women shared with me. They were discouraged from talking about their pregnancies. To me, it seemed like a way to kind of psychologically separate them from their babies, to kind of, and other women described this to me, to distill a sense of dissociation that potentially could make it easier for them to separate from their children. But there was definitely a culture of fear and a sort of punishment around, this sin of premarital sex. A lot of women told me that, they were told that they needed to redeem themselves for the things they had done to their body. And often that path to redemption in the eyes of the Godparent Home was to place their children for adoption.
Mm-hmm. Toni, your story ends with you keeping your baby. And that seems like an unusual result. How did that happen?
I was pretty firm on that before I went to the Godparent Home. My I had a pretty strong support system. My mom, when I left, she was pretty set that she wanted me to place my baby for adoption. She felt that I was 13, and as a 13-year-old, my child really needed and with her strong beliefs, she felt that my child needed a two-parent home, and as a 13-year-old, my child really would do better with a two-parent family. And my grandma had been adopted, and she didn't talk about her childhood, but she just said that she did not want her grandchild to be placed for adoption. So she was just strong in that no matter what, if I came home with my baby, she would help me. So I had a strong support system, and I just said that from the beginning that I was determined I was going to bring her home. So just from the beginning, I just said I was going to bring her home, and I just stood firm in that. If you didn't have a support system, though, they didn't give you a way to build a support system while you were there because you were cut off from everyone. You were only allowed to call who was on your list. You didn't get to have a job. You didn't build any skills to work or set anything up outside of the home. So it made it almost impossible, but I just stood firm and I had a strong support system from the beginning.
But I understand that there was pressure on you to give up your baby, and that even included during your labor.
Absolutely. There was a woman there even as I was delivering, and I was yelling that I had to push, and she was there holding my hand, praying that I would make the right decision after my baby was born, while I was saying I had to push, and I was having complications. My daughter's heartbeat was dropping, and they were trying to get me to the delivery room, and she was praying that I would make the right decision for my child. At the time, they had me look through adoption books. They did everything they could to try and change my mind the whole entire time.
We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue my conversation with journalist TJ Raphael and Toni Popham. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
This is St. Louis Public Radio. Support comes from Perrick Corporation. With a commitment to serving the St. Louis community through local partnerships and charitable support, guided by Perrick's core values. More at perrick.com/culture.
Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. If you were watching TV in the early 1990s, you might remember PSAs from televangelists like Jerry Falwell. Falwell founded Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. He also founded the university's Godparent Home, a program for pregnant young people and their families to get support.
The costs to operate the Godparent Home are enormous, but there's an exciting way you can help.
There is a toll-free number on the screen, 1-800-PRO-LIFE. Call now to get this brand new Liberty Godparent Home Save a Baby Visa card. Please only call if you are credit worthy.
And that was Jerry Falwell himself spreading the word about the Godparent Home in an early 1990s PSA-style message. That promotion is also featured in the new podcast, Liberty Lost, which presents the Godparent Home as an entity involved in something much darker, coercing the young women under its care to give up their babies for adoptions, even when those mothers didn't want to. I'm here with TJ Raphael, creator of Liberty Lost, and also with me is Toni Popham. Her mother sent her to the Godparent Home when she was just 13 years old in 1991. Before the break, Toni, you were talking about the way even through labor, you were being pressured to give up your child for adoption. And TJ, your podcast makes a case that the Godparent Home was involved in coercing young women into adoption. Toni got to keep her baby, but what did you find out about other girls, now women, and what they were experiencing around pressure to give their children up? Did they keep them? Did they end up giving their children up for adoption?
Yeah, so Toni was the only woman that I spoke to of the 5 I was able to identify who were able to keep their children. The rest of the women wound up placing their infants for adoption after their stays in the godparent home. Back in the 1980s and 1990s, in Jerry Falwell's program, the Old Time Gospel Hour, he did hour-long specials on the godparent home. He said about half of the residents at the godparent home placed their children for adoption, and a former staffer I spoke to who was there in the early 2000s said that that number remained consistent even then. And that's incredibly high given that the national adoption rate has hovered around 1% for about the last 30 years. And we're talking about specifically infant adoption through private adoption agencies, not adoption through foster care or something like that. But yeah, about 1% of women who get pregnant will place their infants for adoption. So that's about a 5,000% increase within the walls of the godparent home. And yeah, I was able to identify 2 former staffers to speak on the record, and both of them describe, an environment that really pushed girls and young women to place their infants, and that there weren't support systems or services in place to help those who wanted to keep and parent their children do so. Many of them, if they did decide to keep their children, they were simply turned out onto the street after they gave birth. And most of the residents would never hear from them again and had no idea what happened to them.
Your podcast is critical of the godparent home, and you have people like Toni and others who have described that coercion and pressure to give their babies up for adoption. How is it that the godparent home itself has responded to your reporting?
Yeah, so to date, I have never received any response from Liberty Godparent Home, from Family Life Services, which is the adoption agency that's physically connected to the maternity home, or from Liberty University. I spent over 2 years working on this series, and over the course of a year, I contacted officials from all 3 institutions several times, over every possible means of communication. I had called, I had found their cell phone numbers and texted, I left voicemails, I added people on, or tried to, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and I even sent letters to the godparent home via snail mail. And to date, I've never received a response. I did recently do an interview with the local newspaper in the area, the Lynchburg News Advance, and they responded to that reporter. They dismissed the podcast and called it a tabloid and said that it was seeking to undermine the godparent home's pro-life mission. I, however, all of the women I spoke to wanted to keep and parent their children like Toni. So I find it strange that they suggest that this is attacking their pro-life work when the women I spoke to didn't want abortions. They wanted their babies. So yeah, that's the response that I have not gotten directly, but that they've put out so far.
Just earlier, Toni, we had played a bit of a PSA from the early 90s. And this podcast, addresses the way that Jerry Falwell used the godparent home and its residents as a part of fundraising. How did you experience that directly?
When we were at the godparent home, we would on Sundays have to go to church, and we would be paraded up front. We would have to stand up, and he would continually point us out and talk about us. It would be every Sunday that he would either have us stand in the pews or have us walk up front to point us out, to talk about us, to make sure that he talked about supporting the godparent home, to say he would discuss us regularly to make sure that everyone in the church knew who we were every Sunday.
What did that do to your sense of faith? I mean, did you have it at that time?
Well, it destroyed every bit of faith that I had. It took me years to step back into a church. after I left the home. I did not want any part of religion whatsoever. And I would say that I would not ever go to a church again until I could walk in a pair of jeans and be the way, however I could walk in the door, and they would accept me just the way that I am and not be judgmental at all.
TJ, your podcast focuses on this godparent home, a maternity home that is in Virginia. But Missouri has its own maternity homes, and they receive funding in the form of a tax credit, and that credit was just expanded this year. It benefits about 20 maternity homes in Missouri, as well as 82 crisis pregnancy centers. What is it that you learned about how Liberty Godparent Home it compares to other maternity homes, including those in Missouri?
Yeah, so I mean, Liberty Godparent Home, its influence has extended far beyond its doorstep, far beyond the borders of Virginia. The former director of the Godparent Home sat on the leadership council for the National Maternity Housing Coalition. And so that's a group run by Heartbeat International, which is the world's largest anti-abortion organization. They have a presence on every inhabited continent. And this maternity housing coalition tries to expand maternity homes nationwide. I've looked it up. I think of the maternity homes in Missouri, several are affiliated with Heartbeat International. And so, we see how the Godparent Home's influence, has spread to this national network of maternity homes. And I think in theory, maternity homes are very good. You know, who goes to a maternity home? They're pregnant women in crisis who need help and support. I think where it gets tricky is when they are tied to larger anti-abortion organizations. I know from speaking with a former board member of a crisis pregnancy center, a woman named Katie Burns. She's also the resource director of an organization called Saving Our Sisters, which seeks to support pregnant women in crisis who may be considering adoption because of crisis. She sat on, as I mentioned, the board of a crisis pregnancy center, and she told me that maternity homes affiliated with groups like Heartbeat International or CareNet, which is another anti-abortion organization, they have to sign contracts to support adoption. They have to make sure that they're discipling, Christian messaging. And oftentimes that messaging comes along with these ideas about single motherhood, about a child needing to grow up in a two-parent household. And so I think that maternity homes, again, I think in theory are good. I think people need to be cautious of, the organizations that back them, because sometimes those value systems can push a vulnerable woman to separate permanently from her child when she might not want to do that.
We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to pick up my conversation with journalist TJ Raphael and Toni Popham. We'll talk about the impact of maternity homes in Missouri and hear more about the new podcast, Liberty Lost. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. Let's return to my conversation with journalist TJ Raphael and Toni Popham. Raphael is the creator of the Liberty Lost podcast, which focuses on the Godparent Home maternity house in Lynchburg, Virginia. Popham was sent to the Godparent Home as a 13-year-old in 1991. Before the break, TJ Raphael was describing how maternity homes have expanded across the country after the nationwide ban on abortions. And one of the key points, TJ, that your podcast raises is the way that Liberty University combines its services to teen moms with the goal of adopting children to Christian families. And in looking at a couple of the maternity homes here in Missouri, there are mentions of Christ-centered approaches. There's one maternity home website that described its promise to connect, quote, expectant mothers with prospective Christian adoptive families who may live throughout the country. In the reporting that you've done, is a focus on Christian adoption a consistent feature of these maternity homes?
Yes, I think I look at maternity homes as a stop in a pipeline, really, that is pushed by members of the anti-abortion movement. I think it often starts with crisis pregnancy centers. A pregnant woman who, again, wants to keep her child might be seeking, help and resources if she's a low-income woman and doesn't have access to healthcare services. She might go to a crisis pregnancy center looking for help. Depending on the person she talks to at that organization, they may then funnel her towards a maternity home. And if that maternity home, has a value system that doesn't believe that single women should be parenting, they may then push that woman towards, a faith-based adoption agency. I talked to Gretchen Sisson, who is an academic at the University of California, San Francisco, and she is a sociologist that studies adoption. She told me that 80% of infant adoptions in the United States are done through faith-based adoption agencies. So for, in many cases, if adoption is not about survival, it's about salvation for some women. And so, I think there is an inherent link here. The adoption industry, again, we're talking specifically about private infant adoption. It's a bit of a black box. There's no national regulatory system in place. So it's very hard to get data and numbers to suss out the rates of adoption per maternity home, because those are just numbers that are often offered up voluntarily when they are published at all.
In Missouri, a maternity home is explicitly defined as one that does not perform, induce, or refer for abortions, and that does not hold itself out as performing, inducing, or referring for abortions. And again, from the reporting that you've done, TJ, how does that focus on abortion affect the operation of these maternity homes and their clients who are in a very vulnerable position?
Yeah, I think that, one of the former staffers I spoke to told me that, a former staffer of the Liberty Godparent Home told me that, the mission was to save babies from abortion, but as over time, she came to see, how distorted that mission was, because so many of the women who came into the home were not considering abortion. That's not what they wanted. And I think that if you believe that adoption is a solution to unplanned pregnancy, that can naturally snowball into pressure. And, in speaking with Toni, I remember, Toni, when we did our interviews, you were telling me how the staff, I think, was communicating to you and the other girls at the time that this was about, quote unquote, saving babies from abortion, even though it seemed like the residents that you were with didn't want that.
Yeah, no one there came in there because they wanted an abortion. Abortion was legal when we all came there. And so everyone there had already decided against abortion. We had all gone there because we didn't want abortion already. And so we were there either because we were there because our parents wanted to hide us, or because the Liberty University sent them there because they wanted to hide them, because some of the girls were there because they were students.
You are a mom of 6 children, Toni. You drove here from Union so that we could have this conversation in person. Why did you do that? What is it that you want people to know about how the experience at Godparent Home impacted your life and how you parent your kids.
Well, my daughter that I had when I was 13 also had a child at 15. So, and, she stayed home. He's actually home with my 6-year-old now, watching her while I'm here. And I just can't imagine that hiding your children away, to send them away and not loving your kids through everything. Like I said, I've had 2 kids that have struggled with addiction, and to have someone prey on your children, to try and just take their children or to put them in when they're at their most vulnerable, to try and take something so precious from them. We did adopt our youngest from one of our kids, but we went as long as we could through the foster program, and we spent years of trying to do everything we could to get through recovery and all of that before we got to that point. And I hate that there's still people out there preying on people that need the help the most.
Do you have a message, Toni, for parents and for teens who might be in a similar situation to the one that you were in, that your mother was facing, then looking into a maternity home? Is there advice? Is there something that you want to say to them as they're going through the decision-making process?
There are people out there that are really there that can help you, that they don't have to turn to a maternity home. They don't have to turn to these options they don't have to believe everything that people tell them. There are options. There are people out there who really can help them. And just like she said, there are organizations that said, $1,000 can make a difference in someone's life of keeping their baby or not. There are organizations out there that can help with cribs, that can help with a car, that can help with diapers, that can help with all of those things, that there are real people that want to help and do help.
TJ, now that the series, now that the podcast is done, is there a question that remains for you? And what has the response been to Liberty Lost?
Yeah, the response has been wonderful. Since the series has released, multiple other past residents have reached out to me privately over email, on social media, and in my direct messages to share their own experiences of going through the Godparent Home and placing their children for adoption. I've also heard from a new former staffer who's never spoken publicly about this, as well as some former students. Part of what we cover in the series, last year in 2024, the U.S. Department of Education, the federal government, found that Liberty University was forcing numerous pregnant students to go to the Godparent Home as a condition of their continued enrollment in the university, including pregnant sexual assault victims. And I've heard from some sexual assault survivors who were students at Liberty, and they've shared their stories with me. So I'm so happy that this series has resonated with so many women. I think that there's still a question of accountability here. I had reached out to the Virginia Department of Social Services, which was the entity that oversaw the Godparent Home. The Godparent Home let its license expire with the state in 2022. It can still function because it's a private religious institution. It just can't take in girls from the foster care system anymore. But basically, they said they have no plans to investigate it. When I asked if they plan to investigate the adoption agency, they said no and just directed me to an online complaint form. And the Department of Education also refused to answer my questions about, how forcing pregnant students into a maternity home didn't violate Title IX. They wouldn't answer my questions. And so I think in terms of, for me, what, I hope comes next is, some form of accountability for, the many, many women who have gone through this Godparent Home over the decades. But I am just also grateful to the women who did speak to me. I'm so grateful to women like Toni, who have never shared their experiences before, because I think it's really struck a nerve with so many people who said that they were really touched by the podcast, and it made them change the way that they, saw the world in some ways.
TJ Raphael is a journalist and creator of the podcast Liberty Lost, which debuted last month. It dives into the practices of maternity homes across the U.S. and focuses on the Godparent Home at Liberty University in Virginia. TJ, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me.
And Toni Popham is a mother of 6 who was sent as a teen in the early 1990s to the Godparent Home. She speaks about that experience on the Liberty Lost podcast. Thank you for sharing your story, Toni, with us today.
Thank you.
This episode was produced by Danny Wissentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.